For nearly 50 years, he has shouldered the task of fronting the greatest rock and roll band in the world, and along the way, creating a style and onstage persona which has injected energy, sexuality, danger, and an enigmatic quality to the Rolling Stones' live performances and recorded output. It was, however, over a 10-year period from the explosion of the rhythm and blues and beat boom of the 60s to the rise of the glam rock era of the early 70s that Mick Jagger established himself as the quintessential band frontman and the benchmark that all subsequent artists would aspire to.
What made Mick Jagger? Mick Jagger's glory years are his 20s. They run from 63 to 72. 1973 he turns 30. And rock and roll in its raw state was inalienably associated with youth. And I don't think it's surprising that the period in which Mick Jagger makes his mark and for which he will always be remembered coincides almost exactly with his 20s.
I guess you could say that Mick Jagger is actually the ultimate frontman, the man who really started it all. If you think of the Beatles, obviously you had Paul and John, so it was two people, but with the Rolling Stones it was always really Mick.
The thing about Mick is that he's an original. He's totally unique. If you listen to him on record, nobody really sounds like Mick Jagger. Nobody moves like Mick Jagger. He has a look, and in this business I think you need a look to be remembered.
He had an attitude and an athleticism which no one had had before him and was the model for some who came afterwards.
Well, he was the Elvis of the 60s, in the sense that everybody that followed on was somehow traceable to Mick Jagger.
When you think of other great frontmen like Freddie Mercury of Queen or Bono of U2, what they're doing is variations of Mick Jagger.
He emphasised the fact that it wasn't just a case of standing up and singing a song. You had to do other things as well. You had to sort of dramatise it, I suppose.
He didn't play an instrument, so that freed up his body, as it were, to create this sort of almost shamanic figure. When people talk of the rock star as shaman, Jim Morrison is perhaps the name that most frequently comes to mind. But who was Morrison's role model? It was Jagger. So in a way, you could say Jagger created the template. He invented the role.
Michael Philip Jagger was born in Dartford, Kent in 1943. The son of a local PE teacher, he was well educated and bright, and following the end of the Second World War, he lived a relatively comfortable suburban home life.
Well, Mick was brought up in Wilmington, which was a rather upmarket district of Dartford. Certainly it was very different from the Overspill estate where his friend Keith Richards grew up. And it was certainly a very secure middle-class background, and I think that Mick attributes his behaviour and his attitude towards, and the way that he was able to cope with his later career, to the fact that he did have a very solid background. He did well at school, and he wasn't really all that noticeable, I suppose, until he went to the local grammar school.
Mick attended Dartford Grammar School in 1954 and made the first of many important connections when he became friends with future Rolling Stone bandmate Dick Taylor.
My first day of grammar school, he was in my class, and we gradually got to know one another. Mick was always into basketball particularly, reasonably sporty. I can't say Mick sort of totally sparkled above everybody else in our class, but on the other hand he was always quite outgoing. He was just always pleasant to be with.
Well, it's one for the money, two for the show, three to get ready. Now go, cat, go, but don't you...
Growing up in post-war Britain, there was little to do and usually less money to do it with. However, Mick, along with many of his generation, found that music would provide the social and intellectual focus they craved. Having been interested in music from an early age, it was not long before the lure of rock and roll grabbed Jagger's attention.
Honey, lay off them shoes and don't you step on my blue suede shoe. Well, you can do it.
Mick was excited, I suppose, like everybody else, in a very superficial way by sort of Bill Haley and the Comets. Though surprisingly, he wasn't very impressed with Elvis Presley. I think the first really big sort of pop hero for Mick was Little Richard, who he saw in a film called Don't Knock the Rock when it reached Dartford cinemas in 1957. He liked Little Richard's voice and the way that, you know, nothing seemed to be above this sort of bull-like roar whenever he sort of tackled, you know, Tutti Frutti or Keep a Knockin' or all the other sort of hits that were sort of chasing each other up the hit parade. And I think it was a lot to do with the way Little Richard looked, with that sort of precarious pompadour, and he was obviously wearing makeup and a certain sort of effeminacy about it. I think that was somehow struck Mick as being very sort of daring for the time.
By the time we were at grammar school, I think our musical, certainly my musical tastes had kind of slightly solidified, and so I think had Mick's. So in the sense of him being more of a Little Richard man than an Elvis man was a sort of totally unspoken. We all knew what we liked, you know, and obviously the whole gamut of rock and roll and rhythm and blues was there, but we kind of tended to like stuff which was more on the black R&B. And then we discovered there was a wealth of stuff, you know, and Chuck Berry most definitely came to our notice. And from then on, Bo Diddley, and then more getting into the blues side. And also, in England at the time, there was a big folk movement. And the folk actually, of course, included people like Big Bill Broomsey, who was brought over here. And gradually, we became aware of what the blues was.
Yes, I'm sitting on the soul, stomp baby, got a worried mind. Lord, I'm sitting on the stump baby, out of cloud, got a worried mind.
There was jazz, and the whole jazz scene was very big. And of course, the jazz and blues scenes are highly related. Started hearing people like Ray Charles, and the whole thing kind of clicked that there was an amazing wealth of music which wasn't really in the mainstream.
One of the interesting things about Mick Jagger's first interest in music is that I think it was related to the whole black experience in America. So it was more than just a musical experience. I think at a very early age, he realized that, you know, this was the music of the underdog. I think he probably started out hearing white rock and roll, but very swiftly moved on to where it had come from. And there are stories, for example, of him at Dartford Grammar School, you know, giving a speech to the School History Society about Negro music and its political, social, cultural significance.
Jagger had turned his musical attention to the blues, with Chicago bluesmen such as Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf becoming firm favourites of the passionate teen. Yet their downtrodden lyrics and overtly sexual references were a far cry from Mick's middle-class suburban existence.
Got my mojo waking, just don't worry, call you. Got my mojo waking, but just don't worry, call you. I wanna love you so bad, don't know what to do.
I suppose that to a lot of people it would seem strange that this kind of underclass music from the South Side Chicago or the Mississippi Delta had somehow infiltrated its way over to northwest Kent, you know, to a sort of nice middle-class boy like... He actually wasn't Mick in those days, he was Mike. And certainly Mick Jagger, for some reason, it struck a chord with him. And he began sort of collecting records by, you know, people like sort of Slim Harpo, Howlin' Wolf, and quite obscure stuff as well. You know, the various Sonny Boy Williamsons, Robert Johnson, you know, the Delta blues songster, and certainly became quite an authority on this.
One of the things Mick was great at was scouring for imports, and he managed to always have the latest Chuck Berry album before anybody else. That was kind of what he really liked. You could kind of go down to Charing Cross Road and go into Dobell's, which was principally jazz. But I remember diving into there. They had a little display out front with things they'd actually marked down, and I found a copy of I Can Tina Turner. It's going to work out fine. Stuffed in the box, and I was well pleased. And Mick certainly used to almost have a master plan, I think, for ordering the latest Bo Diddley, Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters.